各位观众，大家好，我是国际焦点访谈的主持人于文琪。今天专访的来宾呢是 Duncan Clark，中文名是邓肯，他是亚洲协会巴黎的联名主席。他在亚洲工作过30多年，是个英国的公民，但是呢，在美国、法国和英国长大。后来在投资银行摩根士坦利工作，之后呢，在中国创业，专做投资顾问，还写了一本有关阿里巴巴的书，成为英国经济学人杂志的年度推荐书，并且翻译成35种语言。那邓肯呢，其实是个名副其实的国际投资者，娴熟国际政经情势，常在国际媒体上发言。尤其近年来呢，在中美关系越趋紧张的情形下，根据自己在对于亚洲和中国市场的理解来向大家分析。他也是个慈善家哦，为此特别和他的朋友在巴黎共同成立了亚洲协会的分会，要积极的促进亚洲对欧洲以及欧洲对亚洲的了解。那今天的访谈焦点呢，主要是放在中国和法国的关系。我们知道，中国主席习近平刚到欧洲访问，那第一站呢，就是法国的首都巴黎。法国总统马克宏以国宴款待习近平夫妇。欧洲共同体的主席呢，也参加了三方的会谈。那根据邓肯呢，欧洲共同体主席是临时受邀的，而原来德国总理也可能会参加，但是最后还是没有参加。这其实是一个很有趣的现象哦，因为本来应该是要呈现的是欧洲团结一致的中国外交政策，但最后呢，还是没有达成这个愿望。那法国的外交，我们知道一向都是不与美国主导的西方世界完全一致哦。去年马克宏到北京访问的时候呢，就因为谈到欧洲国家不应该与中国和台湾关系上呢完全依照美国的路径，而引起了争议。虽然法国不依照美国的外交路径，但是呢，随着法国人民对中国的负面感上升，以及中法贸易之间的问题呢，中法关系还是有很多需要克服的障碍。其中最大的挑战呢，还是中国在乌俄战争当中所扮演的角色。欧洲呢是非常希望中国能够调停，说服普京停止对乌克兰的战争，但是这个愿望呢，似乎到现在都还没有得到中国的回应哦。事实上呢，美国已经有强大的施压，而且有证据说呢，中国在军事上是支援俄罗斯的，甚至美国还威胁说，会采取报复的手段，但是都没有得到北京的回应和妥协。因此呢，习近平到法国的访问让许多人讽刺马克宏，说是法国没有得到什么好处。那我们的来宾邓肯呢，则是认为法国基本上是联合国安理会常任理事国的一员哦。通常如果美英是一阵线，中俄是一阵线，法国的投票就特别的重要了。所以呢，法国会继续采取这个第三条路线。另外，在贸易和科技问题上，邓肯也提到了欧洲对中国的态度是逐渐转向，虽然不像美国什么都用国家安全的角度来看，但是呢，因为现在先进科技发展的太快，欧洲是担心自身的竞争力不够，所以呢，逐渐是采取了保护主义。尤其是在电动车和清洁能源方面，也是逐渐与美国的路线相近。那至于国家安全的考量呢，虽然不像美国这么敏感，但是还是有越来越多的考虑，像是华为还有半导体晶片等产业。那到底法国的外交如何在经济商业利益和政治区域安全当中做平衡呢？以及法国如何在欧洲国家当中继续扮演领导者的角色？请看一下我跟邓肯的对谈。So, what is the significance of Xi Jinping's visit to France, and what did both countries get out of this visit?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, obviously, it's the first visit to Europe in I think over 5 years, obviously, since the COVID pandemic. Um, as you just said in the introduction, I think China wants to showcase its global initiatives. I mean, Xi Jinping has three global initiatives on the different levels, and typically we hear a lot about China's relations with the global South. Very little, of course, other than the tensions about the U.S.-China relationship. So this is an attempt to show that in Europe, China is able to project its ideas and support trade, because there's a lot of pressure to export, as we know, to Europe. But also, as you said, it's highlighting some differences within the European continent, which may be not by accident of this trip. And from the French perspective, I think President Macron is keen, almost more within the European context, to show that he's taking a leadership role, perhaps more than even any attempt to gain that much advantage with China. It's a bit of posturing, I think, to show, obviously, with Germany very much internally focused, with a weaker coalition government, with elections coming, etc., and industrial challenges over energy and so on. Germany is not in the forefront that we're sort of used to the last, decades, really. And France sees an opportunity, I think, to position itself here.
Yeah, it's always interesting for non-Europeans to watch how different European countries have different diplomatic approach as well as a leadership style, right? So, for this trip, for example, in addition to the France-China bilateral meeting, Xi's visit, obviously, to Paris actually started with a trilateral meeting, which, included President of the European Commission, in addition to the French President Macron. And, in this trilateral meeting, and Xi was pressured to address China's overcapacity and other trade frictions, as well as China's role in the Ukraine-Russia war. Did the meeting actually result in anything? Because according to a lot of, again, press coverage, it seems like, Europe didn't get anything out of China.
Well, it's interesting. I think the best way to think of this is some sort of ballet, that basically, I don't forget, over a year ago, President Macron was one of the first Western leaders to visit China coming out of zero COVID, and did bring along the European Commission chair as well.
And why is that? Why did they have to do this together?
Well, I think France is careful not to be seen to diverge too much from the sort of European agenda. And of course, European is a collection of many different states, as we saw later visiting Hungary, on a very different flavor for the European Union. But in this case, don't forget also that this was the 60th anniversary of this year is the 60th anniversary of France-China diplomatic relations. Again, President Charles de Gaulle, who had decided almost unilaterally as he could back then just to recognize the PRC, was years ahead of many other Western powers. So from a Chinese perspective, that's often mentioned, of course, that France was a pioneer in recognizing the PRC. And, even in trade negotiations and so on, it's often used to sort of justify, French access to the Chinese market, etc. So there was that element of this dynamic. But what I understand is Chairman von der Leyen was only invited quite last minute, even perhaps to the surprise or the consternation of the Chinese, who were thinking this would be more of a bilateral France-China affair. And upon landing, I'm sure they knew a bit before, but it was this program was added. Chancellor Scholz had other engagements to do with, I think, the Baltic states. He couldn't be here. I think the idea would have been to have him here, so the three, the France, Germany, and the Commission. But, Scholz had visited China just a few weeks earlier, and actually met with Macron just a few days earlier. So again, like a ballet, there's all these moving pieces on stage.
It's thank you for sharing that. I mean, it's interesting to know that originally Germany was supposed to be part of this conversation. Then it would have been at least, presented a more united European front, right, towards China. And clearly, right, I think, the Europeans have a different approach to China compared to the US. But on trade issues, interestingly, right, increasingly we're seeing that Europeans are taking a stronger stance with China as well. So, on EVs, for electronic vehicles, we're seeing that France, imports or used to import a lot of Chinese EVs, but it seems to be grow into a concern now. And why is that?
Well, we just saw, since the visit of Xi to Europe, we just saw today, it looks like the 100% tariff slapped on EVs by the United States. There were very few EVs going to the US anyway, because they already had high levels of tariff.
Yeah, but the US is always different from Europe.
Correct.
Yeah.
But there is a relationship in that 100% tariff is a sign to Europe that, if they're discussing, low double-digit tariffs, this may argue for a higher tariff to protect not just on the vehicles themselves, but the whole, vertical integration of these companies. If you look at a company like BYD, all the way upstream from lithium, all the way down through the components of manufacturing, the batteries, of course, essentially they're battery companies making, electronics with batteries on wheels, and then down to even roll-on, roll-off ships. Like BYD is building a fleet of roll-on, roll-off ships. So this is an industrial level challenge for Europe.
So I guess my question is, I mean, this has been going on for a while, but why is it that, at least as an outsider, it seems like all of a sudden, they're changing the policy? And so I guess my question, to the extent that, do you think it's partially pressure coming from the US, or truly sort of, all of a sudden the European market feels that, okay, it's, Chinese low-cost EVs are flooding the market, which is, probably an unfair trade practice from their point of view?
Well, yeah, I mean, you could say that the same thing, really. I mean, the US is reacting to what it sees as, an unfair competition, or a competition that they can't really meet head on. And I think Europe has the same. I mean, China is ahead in a number of important technologies, including battery technologies, EV, solar, the list goes on. I mean, a professor at Harvard recently was saying, if you believe in green, you believe in red for the next 10 years, because a lot of these environmental technologies and advances are coming from China. Now, should we punish China for its advances, or should we, invest on our side? But then if China has sewed up, supply chains and raw materials, etc., it's very hard. So no, there is real concern. Don't forget, of course, for Germany, and that was why Chancellor Scholz was in China. The German export engine, a lot of it is centered around auto and all the machine tool companies. And so this is a systemic challenge. And we know that Europeans have been a bit slow, frankly, to adopt. We don't see the same level of EV adoption here in Europe that we see in China. I mean, if you go to Hainan, or now increasingly the streets of Beijing and Shanghai, you can't hear cars anymore because they're all EVs. So China is pulling ahead, and this is the challenge.
Yeah, it's interesting to see, and how China counters this argument, how, they subsidize, those industries and are able to export. And their argument is, they're dominant in the green technologies, and they're trying to make the world a greener place. And, they think the sort of the protectional approach by Europe and the US is just a fear of their, leadership in this area.
Look, there's a nugget of truth in that, but also there's a nugget of, let's look at what's happening in China. The domestic economy is not in great shape. We see somewhat anemic consumer demand. In the meantime, it's very clear, Xi Jinping and the government have been advocating the new productive forces, a way for China to advance, partly due to decoupling pressures from the US, but partly just from a sort of engineering mindset in the leadership there, that, almost like a 1950s throwback, that we can, advance through massive investments in certain areas. And the problem is that leads to, you can call it overcapacity, or not, but China produces way more cars than they can consume currently in China. There's intense competition. I mean, by the way, these cars are extremely advanced. I mean, when you sit in one, as I have in Beijing, a Huawei car, or the new Xiaomi car, totally integrated with your devices, you really feel like we are the ersatz, we're the backward place. But that's a challenge, because are we ready? How are we going to integrate? China's model is just different. So from China, they're looking at exports to save them at this point, but that's going to cause a lot of trade tension, as we see.
Yeah. And more than EVs, right, is France's concern as the US when it comes to other Chinese technologies, whether it's from the competition or a national security point of view. We see that, I think, Li Kaifu just officially introduced the new AI model from China, and watching his video, you feel like, it's like China is declaring that their formal entry into this AI global competition. How does France see Chinese technologies?
Well, even ahead of Xi Jinping's visit to Paris and other cities, President Macron was talking about the need for not to be a vassal state to the United States, for Europe to stand up. He's making some fairly dire predictions to sort of rally people to say, look, we're increasingly challenged from the West, from the dominance of US technology, from the East, physically challenged from Russia, let's not forget that, but also from the rise of China and its technologies. What is Europe's role? And so there is an attempt, for example, in AI to funnel resources, to coordinate across markets. We've just seen a big investment in the UK last week. We've seen earlier with Mistral here in France. But, you know, the scale of these companies is a lot smaller than the US. And I was just talking to an investor in London, and they were thinking, you know, probably this is just a bet. The investment that's going into some of these European AI companies is a bet that Europe will eventually geofence Europe and say, we require these companies to be European, because otherwise they just won't be able to compete. As we've seen in the e-commerce world and internet, we see, sorry to fly here into almost summer in Paris. There we see that Europe is challenged by the big tech dominance of the US, except in GDPR. Interestingly, Europe's done a good job in protecting consumer data and privacy. But ironically, they don't really have their own big platforms.
So it sounds like the Europeans are trying to protect its own market from both the US and Chinese technologies. Is that the right interpretation?
Well, the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, as you know, promotes a lot of onshoring into the U.S. from everything, along with the CHIPS Act as well, and semiconductors, but all kinds of materials. That was early on. President Macron accused the U.S. of being rather protectionist in this area, because a lot of European companies who are involved in this area will look to the US as a market, and even to access some of these subsidies by becoming an American player, or even we see the companies listing in the New York Stock Exchange rather than Europe increasingly to become more American. So there is that challenge. But I think it's a very different dynamic with China, where it's considered, partly there are security concerns, partly there's the whole industrial structure concern.
That's what I wanted to get into as well. So in addition to competition, there is that national security concern as well. And is it as, are they as concerned as the US overall? Because it seems like the US right now applies to the national security lens to almost everything now.
Yeah, and by the way, the US and China are actually kind of a mirror of each other, because we see this with China. Of course, we have a lot of focus on national security, including, for example, concerns over Tesla cars accessing, sensitive sites, and similarly in the United States, talk about EVs. Could they be controlled remotely, and spying technologies and so on. So this is happening everywhere. I think one thing we can say for sure is that the security camp everywhere is in ascendant. So in the US and China, and increasingly in Europe, we've seen a number of arrests and interventions. The challenges us ordinary citizens is we don't really know. I mean, we're told, obviously there will be court cases and trials coming for some of this espionage, but I mean, it's the same really if you go back to the whole controversy over Huawei. I mean, Huawei built stuff cheaper, and actually revolutionized, for example, 4G in Europe, and later bringing down the prices. But we are told that there are security concerns. It's almost unknowable at the individual level, at the company level. It's, the role of the security apparatus in every country is just that much greater. And so this is causing a lot more friction.
So as a savvy investor who knows the world pretty well, are you convinced of this national security concern argument?
Well, there's clearly a concern. I mean, certain technologies, we know are pursued by different nations to advance, military. I don't need to tell you that about Russia and Ukraine, and all the supplies that are coming into Russia there from Iran, from North Korea, from China. Although China is, saying that it's not providing these components, but clearly, we're in a new age now. We're in an age of accelerating innovation, where friendly drones that we use for selfies at weddings are now dropping bombs. So we all have to be aware that technology is moving fast, and so this idea of dual use is increasingly difficult. Some are clearly dual use for very advanced. This is not my area, but rockets and so on. But increasingly, as we've seen in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, this is coming down to consumer level devices. So we all have to be concerned about this, as well as our privacy and our safety. Just as citizens within our own country, this could also be threats from within. We've had, certainly in the UK, there were some drones disturbing commercial air traffic at airports and things like that. So, we're in a new world where technology is more accessible to more people, and therefore there's more concern. But there's also more good that can be done by technology. It's the old argument, technology is a weapon and a tool at the same time.
Yeah, technology is neutral itself. It depends on how it's being used. Since you mentioned the Ukraine-Russia war, we have to talk about it because, during the France-China bilateral meeting, it's also raised as a major issue. But we see that, the bilateral statement coming out of the meeting didn't say anything about Ukraine-Russia war, but it did there's a separate joint statement about the Middle East crisis, and both countries want to see peace and ceasefire during the upcoming Summer Olympics in Paris. So it seems that on this point, China, is unwilling to exert pressure on Putin. And China denies its role in aiding Russia in the war as well. Why is it that Europe still is hopeful that China can play a role, and somehow China is unwilling to cooperate?
Well, I mean, I think Europe recognizes the influence that China increasingly has on Russia. One would say that Russia is increasingly losing its autonomy in some areas to China as a major market for its energy exports, but also you saw recently the Russian space program. They're going to be cooperating with Chinese launch pads and so on. So China and Russia are getting more and more integrated, which means more and more leverage if you can apply, in theory, pressure on China. Now, the question is that going to be seen in the public eye or not? Probably not in any public setting. But I think, there is a hope. And don't forget, actually, President Biden is coming here to Paris, I think around June 6th for the 80th anniversary of D-Day. So the fact that President Macron has a conversation ongoing with Xi, which is much more difficult for the United States with Xi, although they do have them, could be useful when we get down to, these kind of potential peace talks. Because the costs, everybody's losing in this, we know, including European consumers. We've had a lot of inflation. We have the global South suffering from higher fertilizer prices, So there's really no winners in this conflict, but how do you get out of it? This is what Macron's been focused on. Don't forget he tried before. I was going to say he tried before to broker peace with Putin unsuccessfully.
And I think probably compared to other Western countries, I mean, China certainly is closer to Putin. We see that Putin is going to visit Beijing again.
Correct.
Time in 7 months. So how does the French public generally view China and Xi Jinping's visit? And how has the public perception changed or not, perhaps, about China since the COVID-19 pandemic? Because in the US, the negativity towards China has, pretty much grown significantly over the last few years. And what about French people?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the surveys from Pew and others, I mean, that's been a pretty major shift globally, at least in Western nations, of inevitably, whatever the origins and what happened with COVID has not been good, certainly for the way China is perceived. I don't think the visit in itself elicited that much attention almost. I mean, it did within China, perhaps more as a sign of, the first trip to Europe and so on. But within France, there was coverage, but it's really not at the same level as, the crises that are going on in the Middle East, in Russia, what's happening in the US elections. So, but I would agree with you that it's not as default negative coverage, let's say, at least the media as it would be of, the US, China. Because there is, again, the 60th anniversary of France-China diplomatic relations. There's also this issue, don't forget, of cognac and Armagnac tariffs that Xi Jinping has sort of suspended temporarily, I think, which is, we're talking €1 billion plus of exports for France. So, there's some good news in that trip as well.
Would you say, generally speaking, that, China is just further away from French people's life, basically, other than I'm sure trade business people, is very important, but probably not as much to the general public.
Well, I mean, I think you raise an important point. I mean, Paris here is the most visited city in the world, even, not during Olympics years. It's the #1 visit destination. We do start to see more Chinese tourists coming here and Chinese spending, but it's much lower levels than pre-COVID. We see fewer flights. We don't see the same collapse, if you will, of flights to Europe that we've seen to the US from China. So there is more of a China presence. There are more Chinese living here, actually, increasingly. Obviously, you have the students in Europe. There's large numbers. There are, entrepreneurs, filmmakers. There's actually a creative community in Paris of Chinese, So there's maybe a more openness, I think, to Chinese cultural influences here. I mean, France puts culture first in many things, whether it's food or film and others. So I don't think this is so much of a negative at a personal level or a people level. At the political level, look, it's not a good situation. And Macron is trying to maintain some bottom line of communication, with some success, one can say.
Yeah. Well, he visited Beijing, as you mentioned, last year, and kind of got into trouble because he said France shouldn't be caught up in an escalation between the US and China regarding Taiwan. And How does the French public feel about Taiwan in general? It's even on people's radar, or it's just, a place where people don't even know where it is? And has that view changed recently?
Yeah, well, the first thing on the interview, I mean, it's very clear that President Macron should not give interviews at altitude. He's had two bad interviews, and this was our friend Jamil Angelini of Politico, and also the French outlet, Les Echos. But it's interesting that the French outlet didn't report the works that Politico did. So it did get him into some trouble. I think it was, ill-advised.
He later had to explain. Yeah, he later had to explain further. So clearly he, probably didn't think he did a good job by saying that.
Right. So look, I mean, I think within France, look, I mean, like everywhere, I mean, there are people interested in geopolitics, and there are people interested in just watching, TikTok, or just enjoying, walking the dog, right? So, I mean, we have to be, mindful of how many people are into the elite politics. I think generally it's a fairly well-educated population. I grew up in France, and I found the education at the lycée level anyway pretty good. But, you don't know. I mean, people are aware of history, but overall, there isn't the same teaching of history here, of Asian history, as there should be, frankly, and that's across the board. But I think generally one thinks of Taiwan having a pretty positive image here, if only from symbols like bubble tea, which are like every city block. So probably it's like 4 or 5. So no, I think people are pretty well predisposed. Like I said, culturally, I don't think French people are the same. They're not as geopolitically minded, perhaps, as a default, as increasingly we start to see, not driven by media, but reflected in the media in say, the US or UK. There's a lot more focus in the Anglo-Saxon world, it seems, as the French would call it, on things like spying and the threats of technology. I mean, that exists here too, but I think it's not as pronounced.
Well, France is always a little bit different, and it's very proud of its different diplomacy than the US. And like you said, right, it's been that way for decades. And France continues to be very influential on the international stage, not only because of its past, but also it's very active in international organizations and just generally the diplomatic arena. So then what does that mean when the world seems to be trending in a more bipolar system led by the US and China? And France keeps saying, you cannot sort of be the US vessel state, but clearly it's also not on all the way to the China camp either. But what does that mean for France? What kind of diplomacy is trying to conduct itself?
Well, I mean, France is a permanent 5 member of the UN Security Council. So if you think about it, US and UK on one side, France, let's say, more on that side, but a bit more in the middle, and Russia and China on the other. So you can see from China's perspective, it's interesting to continue to maintain dialogue. France is a nuclear power. France has even made some rather strident calls for putting boots on the ground in Ukraine if Russia makes major advances, which has surprised many people. But anyway, France sees itself as a power still, and it is a presence in the Asia Pacific as well. It has over 2 million citizens live in that region. But on the other hand, France is part of the European Union, and we have elections coming up, European elections, which will also, through the council, determine, the new von der Leyen. It may be von der Leyen, but it could be somebody else. So there's a lot of politicking going on within the European context right now. And one other thing to argue, of course, is that it's no accident that President Xi Jinping went to Hungary, where Viktor Orban, of course, is an autocrat favored by people like Trump as well as Xi. But also, Hungary will take on the rotating presidency of the European presidency in June. So, they will have a bit more sway as well. So that's causing some concern, of course, in Brussels, given the belt. So look, this is a new great game. The old great game was, Russia, UK, and India, and so on. But now it's a much more complex global game, as you said, a multipolar game.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Duncan. It's not usual we have a perspective from, France or Europe. So it's especially a learning opportunity for our audience to hear from you. Really appreciate your time and analysis. Take care.
Thank you.